Good morning, students. Today we will study Chapter 2, Nelson Mandela Long Walk to Freedom. Now, Nelson Mandela was the first black president of free South Africa, which became a new nation after the Britishers gave up power. Now, before you read, there is one word right at the beginning, apartheid. And the meaning is given, it is a political system that separates people according to their race, what we call as racial discrimination. Recently, you must have heard in news how that policeman in America, the white policeman, kneeled on the neck of a black man and practically killed him, because of which there was a lot of uproar everywhere in America, not only America but the whole world. And then this movement started, Black Lives Matter. Now, this same thing was done by the Britishers then in South Africa, wherein they proved themselves to be superior to the black people and ruled over them with a lot of cruelty. In fact, Nelson Mandela spent his whole life fighting against this system of apartheid, and he had to spend 30 years in prison. But still, he did not give up, and finally, democratic elections were held in South Africa when the Britishers were forced to give up power and the system of apartheid was abolished and a new South Africa was born, and he was the first black president of free South Africa. And we have a speech which he gives on this day when he was elected as the first president of free South Africa. People from over the whole world came. In fact, invitations were sent out to practically all the countries of the world, and dignitaries and political leaders of 140 countries were present that day to witness this great occasion. And when he gave his speech, he spoke one nice line over there in that speech. He says that never, never again will this beautiful land experience the oppression of one by another. And then there were jubilant scenes out in the streets, lakhs of people from South Africa, men, women, and children of all races, not only black, white, brown, whatever color people say, people from all races joined in the celebration, dancing, singing on the streets with joy. Now we start with the chapter. 10th May dawned bright and clear. For the past few days, I had been pleasantly besieged by dignitaries and world leaders who were coming to pay their respects before the inauguration. The inauguration would be the largest gathering ever of international leaders on South African soil. 10th May is the day when he gives us this speech, Nelson Mandela. He says for the past few days he was surrounded by dignitaries and world leaders whom they all had invited. They were coming to meet him to pay their respects before the new country was going to be inaugurated, a new South Africa. And this inauguration was the single largest gathering ever of international leaders on South African soil. The ceremony took place in the lovely sandstone amphitheatre found by the Union Buildings in Pretoria. For decades, this had been the seat of white supremacy, and now it was the site of a rainbow gathering of different colors and nations for the installation of South Africa's first democratic non-racial government. This ceremony took place in the sandstone amphitheater. Now, what is an amphitheater? It is a building which has no roof. We go to watch movie in a theater. It is a packed house just like our house. A big hall and a screen. Same way is the amphitheater, but it is an open theater. There is no roof over it. So people sit around in a circle. You must have seen pictures of Roman Colosseum. That is an amphitheater. The most famous amphitheater in the whole world is the Roman Colosseum. And that is what is an amphitheater. Now this sandstone amphitheater formed by the Union buildings in Pretoria. This place for decades had been the seat of white supremacy because the Britishers ruled over it. It was their seat. And now, today, he says it is a site of rainbow gathering of different colors and nations. Today, not only white, but people from all country of different color were sitting there. So he calls it a rainbow gathering. Previously, only whites used to sit over there, but today, all kind of colored people are sitting. That is why he calls it a rainbow gathering of different colors and nations for the installation of South Africa's first democratic non-racial government. Why they had gathered there? To install the first democratic non-racial government. Up till now, only whites were ruling. Now there will be people from different parts of the country, different colored people also will be part of the government. On that lovely autumn day, I was accompanied by my daughter Zanani on the podium. Mr. De Klerk was first sworn in as second deputy president. Then Thabo Mbeki was sworn in as the first deputy president. When it was my turn, I pledged to obey and uphold the constitution and to devote myself to the well-being of the republic and its people. To the assembled guest and the watching world, I said. Now, three people were that they sworn in. First of them to be sworn in as the second deputy president was Mr. De Klerk. Then first deputy president was Thabo Mbeki, and when it was the turn of Nelson Mandela to be sworn in as the president of the country, he pledged to obey and uphold the constitution, which is basically the right of every president to do because he is the leader of the country, to obey and uphold the constitution and to devote himself totally for the well-being of the people of his country. So he gave his famous speech that day, a very short and sweet speech. He said, "Today all of us do by our presence here confer glory and hope to newborn liberty. Out of the experience of an extraordinary human disaster that lasted too long must be born a society of which all humanity will be proud." What does he say in this paragraph? He says, "Today all of us by our presence here give glory and hope to newborn liberty." They had just got freedom and everybody is hoping to give glory and hope to this newborn liberty. Why? Because the experience which they had, that experience was an extraordinary human disaster. The rule of the Britishers, which was on the people of South Africa, he compares it with an human disaster, an extraordinary human disaster which lasted too long. Now, why does he say so? There might be multiple reasons for it. Basically, it was the inhumane treatment of the Britishers of this black people, the cruelty of the Britishers of the black people. That is why he says it was an extraordinary human disaster which lasted very long. And he says, from that human disaster must be born a society which all humanity will be proud of. We who were outlaws not so long ago have today been given the rare privilege to be host to the nations of the world on our soil. We thank all our distinguished international guests for having come to take possession with the people of our country of what is, after all, a common victory for justice, for peace, for human dignity. He says we were outlaws. Why he calls them as outlaws? Because the policy of South Africa, apartheid, which lasted very long, this policy of apartheid had practically cut all relations with practically all the countries of this world. South Africa had no relation with anybody because of this policy of apartheid, and the whole world knew what they were doing in South Africa. The British people who were ruling over it, what they were doing was terribly wrong. That is why practically all the countries had broken off all kinds of diplomatic relations with South Africa. That is why he says we were outlaws up till now, have today been given this privilege. He says it's a rare privilege to be host to the nations of the world on our own soil. This is what he says. People who didn't want any kind of relations with us today have come here on our invitation and given us this rare opportunity to become hosts to all these people who did not have any kind of diplomatic relations with our country. And he further says that I thank you all, the distinguished international guests, for having come to take possession with the people of our country of what is, after all, a common victory for justice, for peace, for human dignity. He says he thanks all these international leaders and dignitaries who have come there to take possession with the people of our country of what is rightfully ours. And what is that? A common victory for justice, for peace, for human dignity. We have at last achieved our political emancipation. We pledge ourselves to liberate all our people from the continuing bondage of poverty, deprivation, suffering, gender, and other discrimination. He says, at last we have won our political emancipation, means freedom from restrictions of all kinds. At last we are a free country. And he says, I pledge today, we all pledge to liberate all the people of our country from continuing bondage of what? Poverty, deprivation, suffering, gender, and other discrimination. He says, we all take a pledge today to liberate people from all this kind of bondages of poverty, sufferings, deprivation, and other discriminations. Never, never again shall it be that this beautiful land will again experience the oppression of one by another. This is what is that nice line which I had talked about, that my land no longer will be under any foreign rule anymore from today. The sun shall never set on so glorious a human achievement. Let freedom reign. God bless Africa. This is his speech. A few moments later, once the speech got over, they all lifted their eyes in awe as a spectacular array of South African jets, helicopters, and troop carriers roared in perfect formation over the Union building. It was not only a display of pinpoint precision and military force, but a demonstration of the military's loyalty to democracy, to a new government that had been freely and fairly elected. Now, children, we all know on Republic Day, that is our Republic Day of India, 26th January, there is a parade at Rajpath in Delhi. Now that parade, we see our army, navy, air force troops doing march pass on Rajpath, and practically so many people out there to watch this. Once that march pass gets over, you see in the sky helicopters, jets flying in formation. Same thing happened here also. Helicopters, jets, and troops Couriers rode in perfect formation over the Union building. Now he says it was not only a display of pinpoint precision and military force. Okay, they all know what to do. But he says it was also a demonstration that the military is loyal to democracy, to new government that had been freely and fairly elected. These people of the military, they up till now were in favor of the whites who were ruling over South Africa. But as soon as it got freedom, the military people were the same. That did not change, but today they showed the loyalty to the newly elected government of South Africa, that freely and fairly elected government. Only moments before, the highest generals of South Africa Defence Force and Police, their chests bedecked with ribbons and medals from days gone by, saluted me and pledged their loyalty. I was not unmindful of the fact that not so many years before they would not have saluted but arrested me. Just moments before, all the generals of the army and police, their chests decorated with ribbons and medals of days of the past. We see our military personnel, the clothes which they wear, the uniforms which they are wearing, on their chest are medals and ribbons, which shows their glorious achievements. He says they all came and saluted me that day and pledged their loyalty towards me. And he says, I was not unmindful of the fact that a few years back they would not have saluted me but would have arrested me. This is what was the situation a few years back. Why? Because at that time Nelson Mandela was fighting for the freedom struggle against these same people who today saluted him and pledged their loyalty. But a few years back, they would not have saluted him, they would have arrested him. Finally, a chevron of Impala jets left a smoke trail of the black, red, green, blue, and gold of the new South African flag. Finally, the last piece was a chevron of Impala jets. Chevron is a pattern in which the planes fly, and that pattern is that V-shaped pattern in which all the jets flew, leaving behind a trail of smoke. These were colored smokes. Which color smokes? They were black, red, green, blue, and gold, which depicted the new South African flag. The day was symbolized for me by the playing of our two national anthems and the vision of whites singing Nkosi Sikelel' Afrika and blacks singing Die Stem, the old anthem of the Republic. Now he says this day was also symbolic for Nelson Mandela for one more reason. It was the playing of two national anthems. Normally every country has only one national anthem, but South Africa has two. He says, and the vision which he saw that day when the white people singing Nkosi Sikelel' Afrika, that national anthem which only the colored people of South Africa used to sing, that song, that national anthem was being sung by the whites, and the black people, the colored people of South Africa, singing Die Stem, which was the old anthem when the Britishers ruled over. Now he says this vision stayed with me. That is why he calls it a symbolic thing, that it would always stay with me. Why? Because white people were singing the new national anthem. That means they had wholeheartedly accepted the new leader and the new democracy of South Africa. And the black people, they were singing the old. That old anthem was during the British rule, which they hated like anything. But even then, today they also had wholeheartedly accepted the British as part of Republic South Africa. Although that day neither group knew the lyrics of the anthem they once hated, they would soon know the words by heart. That day, the people didn't understand the lyrics of this anthem which they used to hate, but now they had learned them by heart. On the day of inauguration, I was overwhelmed with a sense of history. in the first decade of the 20th century, a few years after the bitter Anglo Boer War and before my own birth, the white skinned people of South Africa patched up their differences and erected a system of racial domination against the dark skinned people of their own land. The structure they created formed the basis of one of the harshest, most inhuman societies the world had ever known. Now, on the day of inauguration, Nelson Mandela is overwhelmed with a sense of history. And what is that history? He says when the 20th century started, the first 10 years, the first decade of the 20th century, he says after the Anglo Boer War and before his own birth. Now, what is Anglo Boer War? You must have heard the word Anglo Indian. Anglo is British, Indians are we Indians. Same way is Anglo Boer. Anglo is British and Boer is South African. He says once this war had got over, that was before the birth of Nelson Mandela. He says all the white skinned people who were staying in South Africa, they patched up their differences because most of them were fighting a battle for property and all such things, for how the Indian kings used to fight and enlarge their kingdoms. Same way these white people in South Africa were fighting, but suddenly they patched up their differences, all the white skinned people, and they erected a system of racial domination. And a new system of racial domination was erected, and this against that was against the dark skinned people of South Africa. This system was called apartheid, wherein you have this racial discrimination, the word which you normally hear, that difference between the skin color of black and white people. White consider themselves superior to black people, and they put up this system against the dark skinned people of their own land. And the structure which they created formed the basis of one of the harshest and most human societies the world had ever known. This is what happened. They created such a structure that it became the worst and the most inhuman societies ever the whole world had ever known. Now, in the last decade of the 20th century and my own eighth decade as a man, that system has been overturned forever and replaced by one that recognizes the rights and freedom of all people regardless of the color of their skin. And then, what does he say? He says that today things have changed. Now, this is the last decade of the 20th century, the last 10 years, and at that time Nelson Mandela is in the 8th decade of his life, means he has reached 80 years of his, this is the 80th year of his life, and that system, he says, today has been overturned forever and replaced by one which recognizes the rights of every people and freedom of all the people regardless of the color of their skin. This is the new South Africa which now recognizes the rights and freedom of all the people of South Africa. There is no more color difference. That day had come about through the unimaginable sacrifices of thousands of my people, people whose suffering and courage can never be counted or repaid. He says this day has come through unimaginable sacrifice of thousands of the people of his country, whose courage and suffering can never be counted or repaid. Well, this happens with one and all. Practically all the country of this world which got freedom from foreign rule, it came through sacrifices of so many people who laid down their lives to win freedom, and there are examples of sufferings and courage that is everywhere, children. And the same thing happened in South Africa, and he says I can't repay them, forever indebted for their sufferings and courage and sacrifices to win freedom for our country. I felt that day, as I have on so many other days, that I was simply the sum of all those African patriots who had gone before me. And that day he has felt this many times before also, and he says that I was just the sum of all the patriots of South Africa who had died before him. That long and noble line ended and now begin again with me. He says that long and noble line, those people who laid down their lives, they were all very noble people. And he says that long line ended and today it has started again with me for new South Africa. And he says it will start with me and keep on continuing even after my death. I was pained that I was not able to thank them and that they were not able to see what their sacrifices had wrought. He says he felt pain. Why? Because he could not thank them for what they had done. And another reason was that these people who laid down their lives for the freedom of their country, they were not able to see what their sacrifices had achieved. The policy of apartheid created a deep and lasting wound in my country and my people. All of us will spend many years, if not generations, recovering from that profound hurt. But the decades of oppression and brutality had another unintended effect, and that was that it produced the Oliver Tambos, the Walter Sisulus, the Chief Luthulis, the Yusuf Dadus, the Bram Fishers, the Robert Sobokis of our time. He says this policy of apartheid, that is racial discrimination, it created a deep and lasting wound in my country and my people. He says all of us will spend many years recovering from this hurt. Generations will not understand the following generation. Why? Because people who will be born after 1994, they will never know what kind of inhuman treatment their forefathers had to suffer during the British rule in South Africa. But he says it will take time for us. We have to spend many years to recover from that profound hurt. The decades of oppression and brutality, he says, had another unintended effect. He says that this so many years long brutality had an oppression, a reverse effect, that it produced great personalities in South Africa. There are those 6 photographs, and these 6 photographs are those great leaders of South Africa who laid down their lives, sacrificed their lives for the freedom of their country. He says it was because of this oppression and brutality that such great souls were born of our time. He calls them men of extraordinary courage, wisdom, and generosity, that their like may never be known again. Perhaps it requires such depths of oppression to create such heights of character. He calls them men of extraordinary courage, wisdom, and generosity, that we will no longer have people like them anymore, or will be never known again in future. He says perhaps it requires depths of oppression to create such heights of character. And he says such type of people are born. Why? Because of that inhuman treatment which was meted out to them due to the color, racial discrimination met out by the government at that time, that those depths of oppression created men of such heights of character. He says, my country is rich in minerals and gems that lie beneath its soil, but I have always known that its greatest wealth is its people, finer and truer than the purest diamond. South Africa, we all know, is very rich in minerals as well as gems, but that lies beneath the soil, and everybody knows. But he says he was always known that any country's greatest wealth is its people. They are finer and truer than the purest of diamonds. Practically, a country's wealth can be known by how good the people of that country are. And he says, I always counted the people of my country as my greatest wealth, which is, he says, finer and truer than the purest of diamonds. It is from these comrades in the struggle that I learned the meaning of courage. Time and again, I have seen men and women risk and give their lives for an idea. I have seen men stand up to attacks and torture without breaking, showing a strength and resilience that defies the imagination. He says, I learned from these comrades. Comrades means his friends, all these people who laid down their lives. He says, I learned from them that what was the real meaning of courage. Time and again, he says, I saw men and women risk their lives, even give up their lives just for an idea. And what was that idea? That I want freedom. Nelson Mandela was greatly influenced by Mahatma Gandhi, and he too followed the doctrine of Mahatma Gandhi, that was non-violence. That was the weapon which India won its freedom. In the same way, he says that South Africa also won its freedom through the weapon of non-violence, because Nelson Mandela was a follower of Mahatma Gandhi's ideology. And he says that he had seen men and women stand to attacks and torture without breaking or showing strength and resilience that defied the imagination. People who were in rule, the soldiers, they used to beat up people like anything, injuring them badly, and these people used to fall down unconscious, full of blood. Even then, till the last drop of blood in their body, they would not give up. He says he saw such strength in these people which he could not even imagine. The resilience which they had, that was the ability to take any kind of hardship and recover from its effects. These were those people, after falling down unconscious, they will be taken away. Another person will come and stand in his place. He again would be beaten up like anything, and he would too fall unconscious and bleeding all over, taken to the hospital. But as soon as they recovered, they would come back again. He says it defied imagination that people had so much power and strength. Yes, that is what the strength which you get, that inner strength. Why? Because you want freedom for your country. This is what used to happen. And he says, this is what I saw. And that day, he says, I learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the triumph over it. Courage, children, is not absence of fear. You become fearless and you say, I'll walk on the road, and then you will be hit by a running scooter and thrown away, broken bones, lying in the hospital. That is not courage. That is stupidity on your part. Why? Courage is not running in front of a moving truck or a moving car, but courage, he says, is victory over fear. Triumph is victory. This is what he talks. That is what courage is, that you get victory over fear. Brave man is not he who does not feel afraid, but he who conquers that fear. Only that person can be called a brave person, who conquers fear. Who does not feel afraid? No, but who conquers fear. No one is born hating another person because of the color of his skin or his background or his religion. People must learn to hate, and if they can learn to hate, they can be taught to love. For love comes more naturally to the human heart than its opposite. No one is born hating another person just because of the color of the skin. We are not born to hate others. But he says, in which sense we are not born to hate? Whether it be the color of the skin or the background of the person or his religion. People learn to hate, no doubt about it. And if they can learn to hate, they can be taught to love also. And he says that love comes more naturally to the human heart than the opposite of love, which is hatred. We may be hating somebody, but not to that extent, or not that many. Why? Because hatred is not easy to do, and you may not hate all. You might hate one or two persons, but when you go deep down and do a little bit of soul searching, you might realize that there was no need to hate that person, but circumstances happen so. But to love is far more easier. You also might not be knowing whom you are hating today. When you grow up and these emotions take over, that is a different story. But if somebody can be taught to hate, that same person can be taught to love also, because it is more natural to a human heart. Even in the grimmest times in prison, when my comrades and I were pushed to our limits, I would see a glimmer of humanity in one of the guards, perhaps just for a second, but it was enough to reassure me and keep me going. He says, even in the grimmest of hours means when practically the situation seemed hopeless. At that time also, when he says, my comrades and I were pushed to our limits, in the prison also they were beaten up very badly, tortured very badly. Even in those times, he says, he saw a glimmer of humanity. Whenever he saw just a glimmer of humanity in one of the guards, perhaps it was only for a second, but it was enough, he says, to reassure Nelson Mandela and to keep him going that yes, these people who are hating us one day will love us because I see humanity in one of those guards who is not as bad as others. He might be equally bad, but little lesser than the other ones, and that glimmer of hope gave him reassurance and kept him going that yes, one day we will win our freedom. Man's goodness is a flame that can be hidden but never extinguished. This is what it is. Our goodness is a flame which can be hidden, but people cannot extinguish the flame of goodness. Once a good person, you will always remain a good person. That nobody can hide from you. In life, every man has twin obligations to his family, to his parents, to his wife and children, and he has obligation to his people, his community, his country. In a civil and human society, each man is able to fulfill those obligations according to his own inclinations and abilities. But in a country like South Africa, it was almost impossible for a man of my birth and color to fill both of these obligations. He says in a civil society, each man can fulfill those obligations, those twin obligations towards his family and towards his society. But in a country like South Africa, he says it was impossible for a man of, he says, my birth and color of skin to fulfill both of these obligations. In South Africa, a man of color who attempted to live as a human being was punished and isolated. Just see what those rulers of South Africa used to do. Any person trying to fulfill or live as a human being was punished and kept alone. In South Africa, a man who tried to fulfill his duty to his people was inevitably ripped from his family and his home and was forced to live a life apart, a twilight existence of secrecy and rebellion. And say, suppose a man who was trying to fulfill his duty towards his people, that is, fighting for them, fighting for the freedom of his country, that person had to be taken away from his family and his home, and he was forced to live a life apart from them, a twilight existence of secrecy and rebellion, and his existence would become a secret. And because they were all rebels, the ruling party should not know how many are there. Otherwise, what would they do? They would just catch hold of them and put them in prison, and everything used to get over because they would spend the rest of their life in the prison. So they had to live a life of secrecy, leaving their family and going away. He says, I did not in the beginning choose to place my people above my family, but in attempting to serve my people, I found that I was prevented from fulfilling my obligation as a son, a brother, a father, and a husband. Now he says, in the beginning, I did not choose to place people above my family. Normally, family comes first. But here he says, in the beginning, when the freedom struggle started for him, at that time, he did not choose to keep people over his family. But as time passed, and in attempting to serve the people, he suddenly realized that in serving the people, that is, fighting for the freedom struggle, he was prevented from fulfilling his obligations as a son, a brother, a father, and a husband. That is, practically, he wasn't doing anything for his family because he was more engrossed in the freedom struggle. I was not born with a hunger to be free. I was born free, free in every way that I could know, free to run in the fields near my mother's hut, free to swim in the clear stream that ran through my village, free to roast mealies under the star and ride the broad backs of slow moving bulls, as long as I obeyed my father and abided by the customs of my tribe. I was not troubled by the laws of man or God. He says, I was not born with a hunger to be free. I was born free in every way a free person would know. But that time he was just a kid, free to run in the field near my mother's hut, free to swim, free to run through the village, free to sleep under the stars and ride the backs of slow moving bulls. He was free to do anything as long as he obeyed his father and followed the customs of his tribe. At that time, he was a small growing up boy, and he says, I was not troubled by the laws of man or God because he did not understand all these things. He was still a young kid growing up. It was only when I began to learn that my boyhood freedom was an illusion, when I discovered as a young man that my freedom had already been taken from me, that I began to hunger for it. He says it was only when he grew up into a young man, suddenly he realized that when he was a boy moving around, running here and there, swimming in the village rivers, sleeping under the stars, and running here and there, going on the back of the bulls, that freedom was an illusion. It was not a reality. When he grew up as a young man, he realized all this thing, that his freedom had already been taken from him. At first, as a student, I wanted freedom only for myself. The transitory freedom of being able to stay out at night, read what I pleased, and go where I choose. In the beginning, as he was a student in college, he just wanted freedom for himself to do whatever I want to do. But that was what? To stay out late, out of home at night, to do what I want to do, please where I want to go, where I choose to. Later, as a young man in Johannesburg, I yearned for basic and honorable freedom of achieving my potential, of earning my keep, of marrying and having a family, the freedom not to be obstructed in a lawful life. Later, as a young man growing up, he says he wanted the freedom to earn, freedom to achieve according to his potential, and whatever he earns, I will keep with me. Of marrying, having a family, and the freedom not to be obstructed in living a lawful life. These were all different stages of freedoms which he wanted to. But then I slowly saw that not only I was not free, but my brothers and sisters were also not free. Slowly and steadily, as he started to understand things, he realized that not only he, but all his brothers and sisters, basically everybody in his community, nobody was free. I saw that it was not just my freedom that was curtailed, but the freedom of everyone. He thought that only he is not free to move, but then he suddenly realized that everybody's freedom was curtailed. Curtailed is to cut down, to be reduced. And the freedom of everyone who looked like I did, meaning people with dark skin color, everybody's freedom was taken away. That is when I joined the African National Congress, and that is when the hunger for my own freedom became the greater hunger for the freedom of my people. He says, then he realized that this is a big problem, and then he started to understand that they were under a foreign rule, and that is when he joined the African National Congress, and that is when the hunger for not his freedom but the freedom of all the people of his country increased. It was this desire for the freedom of my people to live their lives with dignity and self respect that animated my life, that transformed a frightened young man into a bold one, that drove a law abiding attorney to become a criminal, that turned a family loving husband into a man without a home, that forced a life loving man to live like a home. And he says, this desire for freedom of his people to live their lives with dignity and self respect. Everybody wants self respect, to lead a life of dignity and self respect. He says, because of this, it totally animated my life, it changed his life totally. that self-respect and dignity which he wanted not only for him but for all the people of his country. And he says it transformed me. He was frightened young man. Suddenly it transformed him into a bold man. He was a law-abiding attorney. He was a lawyer who believed in the laws of the country. Suddenly, being a lawyer, he changed into a criminal. Now, he didn't do anything bad, say, suppose robbing people or killing people or something like that. But whatever he was doing was basically for the freedom struggle of the country. So, the rulers of the country, they thought that he's a criminal. Why? Because he's going against the laws of the society. That is why he says, from a lawyer, now I had become a criminal, and turned a family loving husband into a man without a home. Now he could no longer go home. We studied previously that man has twin obligations, one towards his home and one towards his people. He could no longer go home. Why? Because he would be caught and put in prison when he could not fight, and these all things were being done secretly. So he says, family loving husband, now I had no home. And it forced a life loving man to live like a monk. Monk is a sadhu. He says, I was a life loving man, but now I had to give up life. My life had become more like a monk. I am no more virtuous or self sacrificing than the next man, but I found that I could not even enjoy the poor and limited freedom I was allowed when I knew my people were not free. He says, I am not more virtuous or more self sacrificing than the other man. It is not so. The other person was equally like me only, because the other people were, they were also fighting for the freedom struggle. But then I found that I could not even enjoy the poor and limited freedom I was allowed. Why? Because I knew other people of my country were not at all free. Now, because he was a lawyer, he knew many rules. So, and he could manipulate those rules for his own good. But what about the other people of the country? They were not at all free. Because he was a properly literate person who was a lawyer, he understood the rules and he enjoyed the limited freedom which he knew according to the rules. But there were people who never knew all these things and they were not at all free. So he says, I could not enjoy that freedom that way. That also a limited freedom. Freedom is indivisible. The chains on any one of my people were the chains on all of them. The chains on all of my people were the chains on me. This is what he says, that the chain freedom cannot be divided. You are free till this extent, you are free till that extent. It is not so. Either all of you are free or none of you are free. This is what it is. It cannot be divided. And he says that chain on any one of my people were the chain on all of them, and the chain on all my people were the chain on me also. That is why he says that freedom he didn't want, which limited him to a certain extent of freedom. He did not want that freedom. He thought, either I get full freedom or I die fighting for the freedom of my country. But I will get full freedom for all the people of my country. I knew that the oppressor must be liberated just as surely as the oppressed. Oppressor was the foreign ruler over them. Says he must be liberated. Once we get freedom, the oppressor will be liberated and we also will be liberated. A man who takes away another man's freedom is a prisoner of hatred. He is locked behind the bars of prejudice and narrow mindedness. Any person, he says, who takes away other man's freedom is a prisoner of hatred, and he is locked behind the bars of prejudice and narrow mindedness. But natural, if anybody takes away your freedom, that person doesn't like you don't like that person, so hatred is there. That is why your freedom has been taken away. And then that person who is your ruler, he is locked behind what? The bars of prejudice. Prejudice is a strong dislike without any good reason. Somebody told you that this person is bad and you suddenly start having that thoughts about that person, but when you meet that person and you realize, no, there is nothing bad about this person, he's a very nice fellow, but somebody had told you, so you beforehand only started to think about that. That is prejudice. And he says that such people are prejudiced people. Why? Because they are narrow minded. I am not truly free if I am taking away somebody else's freedom. Even if, say, suppose at that time the Britishers were ruling over South Africa, and they were ruling over, so they had taken somebody else's freedom, so they also were not free. Why? Because you never know, when the whole country revolts against you, you are always in trouble, you are always on the lookout if somebody will come and kill you or beat you up. Why? Because you have been so bad towards them. This is what has happened everywhere in world history. If you read or see it, that there comes a point of time when everything goes out of control, and at that time the people who are ruling over, they are more afraid than the people whom they are ruling over. Why? Because they are small in number. So he says that if I take somebody else's freedom, I am also not free, I am also constantly in tension. What will be the next thing which I have to do to stop these people from taking over the freedom which we have taken from them? And then, just as surely as I am not free when my freedom is taken from me, the oppressed and the oppressor alike are robbed of their humanity. This is what happens. The person who is oppressed and the oppressor both are taken away, robbed of their humanity. Why? Because both are now living a life which is not a normal human life which they are supposed to live. So the oppressor and the oppressed both are robbed of their humanity once somebody's freedom is taken.